What should the referee have done after Dani Rojas' penalty? What book was Coach Beard reading in the locker room? What storylines can we expect in Season 2? Keep watching to find out the answers to these questions. Welcome to Square Eyes, a channel where we recap, review, and take a sideways look at your favourite TV shows. This video we'll be taking a look at the first episode of Season 2 of Ted Lasso. Apple TV summarises this episode by saying, AFC Richmond bring in a sports psychologist to help the team overcome their unprecedented 7-game tie streak, which barely scratches the surface of what happens. I'll go into all the details in my in-depth recap. Let's jump straight in. The new season starts with Richmond tied 2-2 with Nottingham Forest in the 90th minute after they've drawn their opening 7 championship games before this one. Dani Rojas has the chance to score the winning goal with a last-minute penalty. He tracks the ball well, but Richmond's mascot, Earl Greyhound, slips off the lead, chases a pigeon and jumps in the way of the ball, stopping it from crossing the line and denying Richmond a goal. Richmond draw the game, and it's even worse news for Earl Greyhound. Trent Crum asks Ted for a comment about Earl's death in a post-match press conference, and instead Ted tells a story about his childhood about a neighbour's dog that bit him. Ted ended up taking care of the dog when the neighbour was no longer able to and became close to it. The story brings a tear to Ted's eye, and it warms the hearts of the hard-nosed journalists in the room too. One asks how Dani is getting on, and Ted says he doesn't know yet, but he hopes he's not being too hard on himself. Dani is, unfortunately, being very hard on himself as he is rambling in the shower and trying to wash the death off him. Back in his office, Ted talks to Nate and Beard about their run of draws. He blames himself, feeling like he's cursed himself after wishing for a draw in the final game of the last season against Manchester City, and now he's drawn every game since. We then find out that Roy Kent has taken on a coaching job since his retirement from playing, as we watch him give a foul-mouthed team talk to his players. Then the camera angle changes, and we find out it's a team of 8-year-old girls, including his niece Phoebe. Roy, Keeley and Phoebe go for hot chocolate after the game, and we hear that Keeley is trying to encourage Roy to take on football punditry work now he's retired. However, Roy is happy doing very little in his retirement. There's also a reference to his retirement press conference, where it sounds like he's embarrassed himself, but there aren't any details. Then we cut to Dani Rojas, whose dreams are haunted by his greyhound killing penalty, and he's losing sleep, despite sharing his bed with 2 different women. He wakes up from his nightmare shouting, "Football is death," the opposite of his usual catchphrase. The next morning, Ted calls by Rebecca's office, and she's disappointed as she wanted to talk to Keeley. Ted says he'll have a go at some girl talk anyway, and Rebecca tries to talk to him about her relationship with John Wing's night, but Ted struggles to stop wittering and joking. On the training pitch, Danny's having a crisis of confidence. Since his penalty incident with Earl Greyhound, he has lost his love of football and it's affecting his ability to play. Ted tries to take his mind off his goal-scoring problems by practicing some corner routines, but Danny's so out of touch he kicks the ball straight into Ted's backside. We called this red arse when I was a child. Back in Ted's office, Ted, Beard, Nate and Higgins assemble to discuss the problem. Beard won't say the word out loud, but he suspects Dani has a case of the yips. This is where a sportsperson develops an inability to do the very basics of their sport for no obvious reason apart from a psychological block. Higgins suggests bringing in a psychotherapist to deal with the issue. Ted isn't sure about the idea, but he agrees anyway. Keeley and Roy are about to double date with Rebecca and her new boyfriend, John. He has a tendency to name-drop celebrities in his stories and seems a bit full of himself. Keeley is doing a good job of pretending she's enjoying his company, but Roy makes it pretty obvious he thinks he's an idiot. As viewers, we're given permission to think John is a complete tool too, when he says he loves football but changes the team he supports depending on which one's winning, something a proper football fan would never do. Keeley uses the dinner time chat to bring up Roy's football punditry job offer again, despite the fact he's already said he's not interested in it. This obviously winds Roy up, but he keeps a lid on his frustration because they're in polite company. Ted and Beard gather in the Crown and Anchor, and Ted talks about his reluctance to involve a psychotherapist after a bad experience he had with a couples therapist where he felt like he'd been set up. Beard reminds Ted of something he told Beard in the past, that all people are different people, and this convinces Ted to keep a more open mind. After their double date, Rebecca asks for Keeley and Roy's opinion of her new boyfriend. Keeley gives some mildly encouraging statements about how they're financially well matched and about the same age. Roy won't play this sort of game though, and he tells Rebecca that she deserves someone who makes her feel like she's been struck by lightning. He tells her not to settle for someone that will make her feel fine. He's right too, and Rebecca and Keeley's reactions show that he's got a point, and that John is nowhere near good enough for Rebecca. The coaches are introduced to Dr. Sharon Fieldstone, a psychotherapist who's been brought in to help Dani Rojas with the case of the yips. Dr. Sharon is unnervingly confident, and it's clear Ted doesn't know how to behave around someone who's so sure of themselves. In fact, all the Diamond Dogs team have the demeanour of naughty schoolboys around her, and Higgins even agreed to let her use his office to conduct her work, even though it leaves him with nowhere else to go. Ted takes Dani Rojas in to see Dr. Sharon, and he still has the demeanour of a broken man. As the door closes, we hear her speaking to Dani in fluent Spanish, and Ted looks unnerved again by her competency. Rebecca is having a coffee with John, and it's obvious that Roy's words are ringing in her ears about him not being good enough for her. Without meaning to, as she's talking out loud, she realises that she needs to be braver in her relationship decisions and breaks up with John. After a single session with Dr. Sharon, Dani Rojas seems to be fully cured and back to his buoyant self as he runs onto the training pitch full of enthusiasm for football again. He goes to take a corner, but this time he connects perfectly with the ball and it flies straight into the far top corner. Dani Rojas is really back. After training, Dani Rojas pops by Ted's office and he tells him what Dr. Sharon told him to help him get over his slump. It was even though football is life, football is also death, and that football is football. But mostly that football is life. Profound stuff. Ted goes up to Higgins' old office to thank Dr. Sharon for the work that she did with Dani Rojas, but he's told by Higgins not to go in because she's got another client in with her. It's Colin, and he says that she's amazing as he leaves her office. Then Thierry goes in next, and Sharon speaks fluent French to him. Ted is obviously irked by so many players seeing the psychotherapist, but he pretends that it isn't bothering him. As Keeley is leaving work for the day, she's on the phone to Roy and apologises to him for trying to change his mind about the pundit job on their date night on the previous evening. Keeley offers to get a bottle of wine for them to drink that night to make up for it, but Roy has plans with the yoga mums. They're watching a programme called Lust Conquers All, which sounds similar to Love Island, and Jamie Tart is one of the contestants on the show. Roy needs a top-up of rosé as the rest of the yoga mums lust after his former teammate. The first season of Ted Lasso won rave reviews for being an uplifting and light-hearted watch, so it was a brave move to open this season with a storyline about killing a dog. Even more so when the person doing the dog killing is Dani Rojas, the most joyful and sweet character in the show, and possibly the history of television. While I wasn't particularly attached to Earl Greyhound, it's never nice to see fictional animals being hurt on screen. I'm still bearing the emotional scars of watching Watership Down as a child. The other storylines in this episode had similar issues of going down difficult paths, such as addressing Roy Kent's lack of purpose since his retirement, Rebecca dating a man that she isn't interested in, and Ted being cautious about allowing a psychologist to work with the players. I like this episode because it brought us back into Richmond and kicked off the new season, but there was a lot of heavy lifting to be done with each storyline, as we left last season with everything tied up without any loose ends. So it was a cold start, and there's a bit of huffing and puffing required to get into a flow with the story. It's not that these new stories aren't good, it's just that it'll be far more interesting once we get to the meaty part of the season. So this episode involved putting in a lot of the groundwork for later on. Having said all that, this episode did deliver some excellent moments, like the speech Ted gives to the press about his neighbour's dog, a true shaggy dog story. And when Roy Kent tells Rebecca not to settle for someone that's fine, it actually gave me goosebumps. It's superb writing and a great moment in the series. I think this episode is good in its own right, but more importantly, it sets up for the rest of the season, and I think it's more likely that the story threads that started in this episode will come back later in the season. I'll cover this in more detail in the looking ahead section. My favourite line in this episode comes from Roy Kent when he says to Rebecca, "You deserve someone who makes you feel like you've been struck by lightning." Only he says it with an extra swear word in there. It's obvious from the meal that we see that John isn't a very nice guy, and Rebecca could do better, so it's nice to see Roy speaking his mind. While Keeley was being diplomatic when she thought of polite things to say about him, I think what Roy said was kinder in the long run, because it shows he cares about Rebecca and wants her to find a relationship that makes her happy. The title for this episode, Goodbye Earl, is a reference to a song by the Dixie Chicks, who have since renamed themselves the Chicks. That song is also about the death of someone called Earl. The mascot being called Earl is a kind of pun, because of the tea called Earl Grey, as he's Earl, the greyhound. I'm not saying it's funny or you have to laugh, I'm just pointing it out. The nearest incident I could think of to Dani Rojas' penalty hitting Earl Greyhound and stopping the penalty was when a ball ricocheted off a beach ball and went in the net in a game in 2009. It was a Premier League game between Sunderland and Liverpool, and the goal was given to Sunderland's Darren Bent despite outrage from Liverpool's players, coaches and supporters. The referee should have disallowed the goal because of outside interference, but he thought the ball had hit a player and deflected in, not the beach ball, so saw it as a legitimate goal. Similarly, Dani Rojas' penalty should have been retaken because of outside interference, but it was obviously key to the story that Richmond didn't score that penalty. I like to keep an eye on the books that Coach Beard is reading. In the office in this episode, he is reading The Greatest by Matthew Syed. The subtitle is The Quest for Sporting Perfection, and the book looks at the habits of great athletes and sports people and shares what they have done to achieve excellence. I thought that Richmond would find the football side of things a bit easier after their relegation from the Premier League, but they've drawn their first 7 games now, so they haven't had a great start to life in the Championship. Their first priority will be to start winning games as quickly as possible in the future episodes. Teddy's also going to have to adjust to having Dr. Sharon around, as she started working with a host of other players after helping Dani Rojas recover his love of football. Roy Kent, in theory, shouldn't really be part of the show anymore because he's retired from football, but he's too big a character not to be involved, so we'll no doubt follow him as he works out what to do now he's not playing. Keeley wanted him to become a pundit on TV, but he seems less keen on the idea. Then there's Rebecca's love life, which has faltered now she's called off her relationship with John, but she spoke about taking more risks and being more available for romance, so it might be that we see a love interest for her as the season goes on. So there's going to be plenty to look forward to in this season. Thanks for watching this recap and review of Season 2, Episode 1 of Ted Lasso. If you've enjoyed this video, please give it a like. I'll be posting my review of episode 2 in the next few days. Please subscribe to make sure you don't miss it. Goodbye.